Hello, my name is Aline Lerner, and I'm the CEO and founder of interviewing.io. Predictions are hard, and they mostly end up wrong, so you can imagine that I didn't really want to do predictions for 2024, because who wants a record of them being wrong, and potentially very specifically wrong, on the internet? But then I realized that the data we have, especially our proprietary sales data, could be really useful for engineers in a tough and uncertain market. So I swallowed my pride, and this presentation is the result. By the way, if you see me looking down sometimes, it's because I totally have a cheat sheet. I have all the papers. So before we get started, in case you don't know who we are and what kind of data we have, interviewing.io is an anonymous mock interview platform and a recruiting marketplace for engineers. Engineers use us for mock interviews, and companies use us to hire top performers. In our lifetime, we've hosted over 100,000 technical interviews split between mocks and real ones. Data from these interviews helps us get an insider's perspective on what's actually going on in the engineering market. For instance, we know how many people are practicing for interviews at, say, Google versus Meta versus other FAANGs. We also offer salary negotiation help. So that means we know how often people are negotiating, how successful they are, and what their compensation looks like. And we also know what the bar looks like for different kinds of interviews, how well you have to do to pass algorithmic interviews, system design interviews, and so on. All right, friends, we have a lot to talk about, so gird your proverbial loins. First, we're going to talk about our data sources and how we got that data. Then we're going to start with open tech jobs and layoffs. Next, we'll talk about what's going on at specific FAANGs using that proprietary data that I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about which companies are actually hiring. We'll talk about salary negotiation and why it's an important trailing indicator. Then we'll talk about compensation data and whether it's effective to negotiate in this climate. We'll talk about the changing role of recruiters and how it affects you. Penultimately, we'll talk about down leveling and the rising bar in interviews. And then finally, we'll make some predictions and give you some hopefully useful, actionable advice. That's a lot, so you probably want a spoiler. And as expected, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that hiring is indeed coming back, and I expect that we'll be close to pre-downturn levels by Q2 of 2024. But that's not all. Let's get into the data first. I already talked a bit about the kind of proprietary data we have. In addition, we've run several user surveys asking people everything from where they're interviewing and whether they've negotiated to how this job search compared to past ones. And finally, we also looked at external market data, so things like number of open jobs, recruiter productivity, compensation, and of course, layoffs. Okay. First, let's talk about open tech jobs and layoffs. To gauge how many tech jobs there are right now, we've been using something called the TrueUp Index. TrueUp indexes open tech jobs at tech and tech-ish companies that have one or both of the following traits: product and services that would not exist without the internet, and/or raise money from a VC. That seemed indicative of the kinds of companies we care about. So, as you can see from the graph, tech jobs started to drop in May of 2022. That's around the time that the FAANGs froze hiring, of course, and began to recover slowly in March of 2023. At the same time, layoffs are way down after peaking in Q1 of 2023. The number of people laid off is down by 88%, and companies doing layoffs are down 68%. Most importantly, layoffs have solidly returned to pre-downturn levels. Back to open tech jobs for a moment. When we saw fewer and fewer people booking mock interviews in 2022 and saw our revenue start to drop, we started to use the TrueUp Index as a sanity check to learn if it was just us. Turns out, fortunately, it's not just us. Here's the same graph, overlaid with mock interview purchases on interviewing.io. We've hidden the y-axis values because we're not comfortable sharing our exact sales figures with the world. But honestly, the shape of the graph is what matters most anyway. along with feeling some relief that we weren't entirely to blame for fucking up our business and could, in good conscience, cast some blame on macroeconomic conditions, we noticed one other interesting thing. Purchases on our platform mirror what's going on in the outside world and the broader market, and effectively give us insight into hiring trends. If you believe, like we do, that purchase activity is a good proxy, then we conclude that eng jobs appear to be recovering faster than tech jobs as a whole. In this graph, hiring started turning around in January of 2023 and has grown by about 58% since then, with most of that growth happening between Q3 and Q4 of this year. We'll be using interviewing.io purchase activity as a proxy for open eng jobs for the rest of this talk. As you'll see in the next few sections, our mock interview purchase data is tightly coupled to events in the outside world. In addition to learning what's going on with hiring as a whole, our data shows us what's going on at specific companies, letting us see which ones are actively hiring and how much. We can clearly see when companies freeze, go on hiring sprees, or just start hiring a little bit. Since many of our users are preparing specifically for FAANGs, we'll start there. Now, I know that many of you work at FAANGs, so as we're going through specific ones, if you see something inaccurate, please tell us and we'll fix it. We did our best to do some fact checking, but of course, we may have gotten it wrong. And finally, are FAANGs the be-all and end-all of hiring? No, of course not. But as we saw during the 2022 downturn, what happens at FAANGs tends to trickle everywhere else because of their sheer hiring volume. So we can use FAANG as a good predictor for the rest of the market. Okay, so let's start with Google. Here's a graph of Google-specific purchasing activity on interviewing.io over time. As before, we've hidden y-axis values, but what matters most is the shape of the graph. As you can see, it tracks with what was happening in the world. Google slowed their hiring in May of 2022, along with other companies like Uber, and officially froze hiring in July of 2022. Since then, Google's hiring has continued to slow, falling about 90% from peak and about 50% since January of this year until it finally leveled out in July. The latest news we've heard is that while Google is currently hiring, it's primarily backfills for attrition, namely people who are leaving, rather than new headcount. Okay, I have a lot to say about Meta. Like Google, Meta froze hiring in 2022. They actually did it before Google. It was officially announced in May. However, unlike Google, they're currently hiring aggressively. And if you believe that mock interview purchases are a good proxy for hiring volume, they're up about 800% since January of this year and are now back to pre-freeze levels, though not yet back to peak. Yeah, it's the part of the graph that says, whoa. Some anecdotal data we have backs this up. At interviewing.io, as I mentioned, we offer salary negotiation help to our users, which means that we talk to a lot of people in depth about where they're interviewing and how it's going. Almost every negotiation candidate we've had recently has been interviewing at Meta. What's even more interesting is the volume of possible teams that candidates talk to during team matching. Earlier this year, Meta's story seemed to be, we're primarily hiring for backfills. There are 1 to 2 teams that might have open headcount. You got to decide fast or those slots are going to be filled. Now our users are regularly presented with more than 10 teams to choose from. Meta's hiring boom, relative to most other FAANGs' conservative hiring practices, has one notable dark side. Meta's hiring volume is clearly outpacing all the other FAANGs. You'll see that Netflix is also up, but Meta's Eng team is something like 10x the size of Netflix's. So in the absolute, Netflix's hiring volume isn't enough to balance Meta out. So for all intents and purposes, Meta is the only FAANG that's really hiring at scale. And because of that, because of the effective monopoly they have, they're currently getting away with treating candidates quite poorly. We'll talk more about this in the down-leveling section, but Meta has capitalized on the market imbalance and has been rampantly down-leveling candidates, presumably because they can. In the pre-downturn market, competition would have made that difficult. But now, given that they're responsible for much of FAANG hiring volume, they can rely on candidates not having many comparable counteroffers and can present candidates with lowball offers out of the gate. Outside of down-leveling, which in fairness doesn't happen to every candidate, Meta has also changed their stance on negotiation. Before the downturn, it was basically enough to say that you were interviewing at Google to get a signing bonus, or in many cases, a higher signing bonus. Now, Meta will not lead with signing bonuses, in our experience, unless you've been down-leveled, in which case they'll use them as kind of a consolation prize. That's still cheaper for them because it's a conditional one-time payment rather than a salary. Moreover, Meta will not negotiate unless you can show higher counteroffers. Now, they don't make you actually show the paperwork, but they ask for details. Recruiters have been trained to say something like this: hey, I'll go to bat for you and take this to the compensation committee, but only if you can show me a compelling reason, i.e. other offers. If you can't show other offers, they will not budge a dime. Finally, Meta has gotten much more aggressive with offer deadlines. Recruiters will push you to sign within a day or two of completing team matching and getting your offer numbers. These kinds of high-pressure, candidate-unfriendly practices would have been unthinkable in a more competitive market, but right now Meta can get away with it. I would argue that their strategy is short-sighted, because this kind of market instability can't last long, and when the other FAANGs are back, Meta will start to see serious attrition for the engineers they've down-leveled and lowballed. I hope they get their comeuppance because they've created so much unnecessary stress and sleepless nights for our users. I stumbled over that because it makes me angry. It makes my blood boil. Now, Amazon is an interesting beast. After both Google and Meta froze hiring in the summer of 2022, Amazon went on an opportunistic hiring spree. You can see that in the graph. Mock interview purchases do indeed reflect what's going on in the outside world. After a few months of basically a monopoly on hiring, Amazon pulled back and froze in November of 2022. They've been flat since January of 2023, and from what we've heard, are only hiring for backfills and very senior roles. It is rare to see one FAANG deviate so drastically from the others when it comes to hiring, whether aggressively hiring when everyone else has frozen or pausing when everyone else is hiring. It creates an unstable equilibrium, one that can't last very long, and this is important. We'll talk a bit more about it later. Microsoft officially froze hiring in Q4 of 2022, though unofficially it seems to have been much earlier, probably in July. Since then, their hiring has been flat, and from what we heard, largely limited to backfills. Apple, on the other hand, did not freeze hiring in 2022, and has continued to hire on a deliberate basis. Headlines about it have been consistently misleading, though. And they're the only FAANG that hasn't done a large-scale layoff. Apple's hiring has been slow for the past year and a half, but has fallen about 70% since January of 2023. We couldn't find an official hiring freeze announced by Netflix, but according to blind and anecdotal reports, they slowed down hiring on a department-by-department basis. We have a gap in our Netflix purchase data because we stopped offering Netflix-themed practice for some time. That said, we have been offering Netflix practice since the beginning of 2023, and since then, demand appears to have grown, up almost 300% since January of 2023. We surveyed our users to see where they're interviewing and have compiled a resulting list of all the larger companies. In cases where we've written guides for these companies' interviewing processes, which we've been doing more and more of recently, I've linked to them in that doc as well. By the way, you'll see a link to that doc in the video description, as well as some other useful resources. It appears that despite the slowdowns and primarily just hiring for backfills, FAANG is still dominating. Over half of our users are interviewing at FAANG companies, with startups comprising only 17% of interview volume. I've been seeing a lot of news articles about how startups are really having a hiring moment right now. That doesn't bear out in our data. Before we analyze all these disparate FAANG data points and connect them to our 2024 predictions, I have a few more important pieces of data to share with you, and one of them is salary negotiation data, which is an important trailing indicator. You already know we do salary negotiation stuff. I've mentioned it a few times, but I actually lead a lot of those sessions myself, and in fact, it's one of the most rewarding parts of my job. It gives me a direct line to our users and an invaluable ear to the ground. Users share with me and us where they're interviewing, how it's going, and what their offers look like with respect to both compensation and level. This is a graph of salary negotiation requests over time on interviewing.io. There are a few important things that jump out immediately on this graph. First, you can see that salary negotiation requests were at a relative high in June of 2022. Then they took a nosedive in November of 2022, dropping by about 4x. You can see that salary negotiation activity roughly has a 3-month delay on mock interview activity, which makes sense because people tend to start thinking about negotiation around the time it looks like they're going to get an offer, whereas they start practicing much earlier than that. Though negotiation requests are still not up to peak levels, they've been growing steadily. They've been growing steadily and have 2x'd since the start of 2023. One other bit of anecdotal negotiation data confirms that hiring is on the rise. We have seen our candidates interviewing with roughly 2x more companies in Q3 and Q4 than in Q1. Because of the delay between practice and ultimately real interviews and negotiation, salary negotiation requests are a trailing indicator. In other words, these changes in salary negotiation are only observable after hiring volume has already shifted. Therefore, they don't predict changes in hiring volume, but rather confirm them after they've already occurred, and ultimately help demonstrate that the growth we're seeing in hiring is not a fluke. All right, friends, now let's talk about money. We already talked about the kinds of insights we get from our salary negotiation program, both qualitative and quantitative. One of the quantitative pieces is offer sizes broken down by cash, equity, and bonuses. The green graph is average total compensation, initial offers before negotiating, and just for public companies, as we don't presume to accurately value private company equity. Nobody really does, among our users over time. As you can see, it has largely stayed flat despite the downturn. We were also fortunate to get a data set from the folks at comprehensive.io, a source of comp data from the maker of layoffs.fyi, which I'm sure you've heard of. What we really liked about this data set is that it had engineering salaries for the kinds of end roles that our users were actually targeting. If you look on Indeed or Glassdoor, you get a very wide range of salaries, and the median ends up being something like 110K, which didn't feel right for our user base. So as you can see, Comprehensive.io's data backs up what we've seen among our negotiation users. Compensation has indeed stayed flat despite the downturn. Now here are a few tidbits not visible in the graphs on the previous slide. Based on our experience, even if salaries have not changed, negotiation dynamics certainly have. First, we have not seen a difference in the average increase from successful negotiations. It's now much harder to negotiate successfully without multiple offers than in H1 of 2022. I talked about that at Meta specifically, but it's true at other companies as well. And finally, companies are much less likely to lead with a signing bonus, except when you've been down-leveled. All right, now let's talk about the changing role of recruiters. Let's take a look at the graph on the left first. The black curve is the same one we've seen before. It's mock interview purchases on interviewing.io. And as you remember, we have found that to be a good proxy for what's going on with Eng hiring as a whole. Since the start of the year, mock interview purchases have grown by 58%. And we think that resulting Eng jobs have grown by about that much as well. The dark blue line is new. It's the number of open tech recruiter jobs over time. As you can see, engineering jobs are recovering, but recruiter jobs are not. In fact, since the start of the year, open recruiter jobs have shrunk by 52%. We'll talk about the implications of this disparity in a moment, but first, let's look at the graph on the right. This graph comes from Ashby, a new applicant tracking system, or ATS, that's used by a growing number of startups and tech companies. Because they're an ATS, they have a treasure trove of data about who applies to what jobs when. As you can see, since the start of 2023, inbound applications for technical positions have doubled. Plainly put, the number of Eng positions recruiters are responsible for filling is increasing, and the volume of applicants is growing, while the number of recruiters among whom that work is distributed is shrinking. You might argue that recruiters might not end up having to do more work because this disparity will force them to rely even more on automated filtering of applications. This may very well be true. However, whether increasingly harried recruiters will take less time to review applicants, or whether this is a new opportunity for a wave of resume filtering solutions, one thing is clear. While applying online has always been a pretty bad idea, bad, because it's the moral equivalent of shouting into a black hole, it's more true now than ever before. In addition to the market data we just saw, we have some anecdotal info and survey results. In our survey that preceded this video, 17% of senior engineers cited that getting in the door was the hardest part of their job search, even harder than technical interviews. So do not apply online in this climate, full stop. Instead, reach out to hiring managers. Recruiters are not incentivized to break rules and will likely not get back to you, especially if you don't look perfect on paper, which most people don't. Moreover, the numbers will be on your side as relatively few candidates are targeting hiring managers directly. You can do the following, and we can do a whole video on how to do this, but for the purposes of this video, we'll keep it brief. First, we recommend getting a LinkedIn Sales Navigator account. Then, because you can use that to search for engineering managers at specific companies, you can do a search and make a target list of hiring managers that might be good to reach out to at the companies that you're interested in. Finally, figure out their emails. You can use a tool like RocketReach, which I like, and send them something personalized. Do not use LinkedIn to reach out to hiring managers. In the same way that you don't really live in LinkedIn and probably find it annoying, they don't live in there and they also find it annoying. Now let's talk about something kind of unpleasant: down-leveling and the rising engineering bar. As I mentioned, Meta has been down-leveling candidates. It usually manifests as a single level down, so you might interview for an E5 role and then end up as an E4. This kind of down-leveling has happened to almost every negotiation client that we've had who's interviewed at Meta. We're seeing this a lot because Meta is doing a lot more hiring, but they're not the only company that's down-leveling. According to our survey, of the people who got offers in 2023, 33% were down-leveled. Most were one level, some were two. We didn't have enough data for Apple and Amazon, but using our survey results, we've computed the probability of getting down-leveled at the rest of the FAANGs, given that you received an offer there. At Netflix, it's 50%. Meta is 55%. Google is 59%, and finally Microsoft is a whopping 66%. For all other companies, small startups, large startups, and FAANG-adjacent companies such as Uber and Stripe and others, the probability of getting down-leveled is about 37%. As you'd expect with the rise in down-leveling, the bar for interview performance has been going up as well. And this rising bar accounts for some of the down-leveling that we're seeing, though we expect that the cost savings for the employers who are doing the down-leveling accounts for much of the rest. The rising bar makes sense. After all, more engineers are competing for fewer positions. Because we have a bunch of interview data, we can actually quantify that increase. After every interview on our platform, whether it's a mock or a real one, the interviewer leaves feedback. You can see what the feedback form looks like in the bottom left there. It includes a yes/no question for whether the interviewer would move the candidate forward, and it includes star ratings of their performance on a scale of 1 to 4, where 4 is best. These ratings cover 3 areas: coding ability, problem-solving ability, and communication. To track how the bar has changed over time, we can look at the average coding and problem-solving ratings for successful interviews. In other words, how well do you have to do for the interviewer to move you forward? We haven't focused on communication ability because we previously discovered that it doesn't significantly affect interview outcomes except in very senior roles. As you can see in the graph, the coding and problem-solving scores for successful interviews have risen steadily since the start of 2022. To make these numbers concrete, you now need to perform 22% better in technical interviews than you did at the start of the year with respect to both coding and problem-solving. We came up with these numbers after bucketing interview performance into percentiles. That's more realistic than just looking at average raw scores, because relative differences in raw scores may amount to much larger or smaller differences when competing against other engineers. At the start of 2022, you had to be in the 65th percentile to pass. That means outperform 65% of engineers. At the end of 2022, you had to be in the 78th percentile. Now, you have to be in the 83rd, which means you have to outperform 83% of engineers. This data is corroborated by our users' experience with the job market. In our survey, we asked our users if they felt that the bar was higher and or if the interview process was more difficult than the last time they were interviewing. 77% said yes. Okay, now on to the actual predictions and then some hopefully useful advice for you as well. Our first prediction is that mid-level and senior eng hiring will pick up significantly come January of 2024. We're less confident about this part, but we expect that hiring will be close to H1 2022 levels, namely before the downturn, by this spring of 2024. Here's why. First, Meta and Netflix mock interview bookings and subsequent hiring are way up, 800% and 300% respectively. Just having two FAANGs hiring is untenable because this type of unstable equilibrium can't last long. Second, open tech jobs are growing. They're up 14% since February of 2023. Tech layoffs are down, and specifically the number of people laid off is down 93% since January of 2023. Mock interview bookings are growing. They're up 58% since January of 2023. And finally, salary negotiation is up 100%, and that's actually a trailing indicator. Even though hiring is coming back, the world will sadly not be exactly the same as it was during the boom. For the foreseeable future, and by that we mean the next 6 months, compensation at a given level will stay flat, just like it has been. Down leveling will continue because of inertia, unfortunately. Recruiters are going to be way worse at their jobs than they have been, and it's going to become increasingly important to find a way into companies without applying online. And finally, the bar will not return to where it was, and we expect it will stay at least 20% higher than at the start of 2022. And finally, here's something completely different, a bonus prediction, if you will. This might feel kind of random because we haven't discussed AI at all till now, but we've been doing some experimentation internally on how tools like ChatGPT are going to change technical interviewing. We'll publish the results of that soon. And we decided to include an AI prediction because, frankly, the topic is just too hot and salient not to. So, despite all the hype about how AI is totally going to change everything, we expect that for a long time into the future, we're not going to see major changes to technical interview styles. We will, however, see changes to interview questions. Specifically, companies will have to move away from asking verbatim leak code questions because of how easy it is to cheat. Outside of interview questions, we do expect that async coding tests will probably go away again because of how easy it is to cheat, even easier than in a synchronous interview. And finally, and maybe selfishly, we expect that there will be a premium on good human interviewers. Finally, here's our advice for you, as well as some useful resources. And of course, all of this stuff is going to be linked in the video description as well. First off, and we've harped on this a lot already, don't apply online. Get referrals or contact hiring managers directly. Next, if you're already an Interviewing.io user and a top performer, please use our company introductions feature. If you use it, we get you in front of a decision maker human at that company immediately, foregoing the need to do outreach or get referrals. Use our company process guides to help you plan your job search and to prepare for specific companies. It's really good. We have a list of a ton of different companies, and if you click into, and this is all publicly available, you can just go to our learning center and then get in here. So we have very, very detailed write-ups of exactly what these processes entail, all the steps, the kinds of questions you can expect to get asked at different parts of the process, how long it takes, and a bunch of other useful details. Use our whole learning center. Outside of company process guides, it has explanations of technical topics, a bunch of interview replays generously shared by our users with the community, and a whole lot more. Prepare for your interviews. You don't have to use us. Just find a way to practice with a human before your real interviews. And if you're not ready to practice with a human, we have a free AI interviewer. It's kind of a midpoint between grinding on leak code and paying for a human, or doing an interview with a human, but it looks like this. So you get asked a question, and then you can talk to the AI, and it'll give you pretty accurate feedback at the end. Try it out. It's good. Study for system design. We have an amazing free guide to system design interviews. It's basically a book. You can see it's quite long. This was months and months of a labor of love, and we're very proud of it. We hope it's useful for you. Lackluster performance in sys design interviews is the main reason that people get down-leveled. And finally, in this climate, negotiation is harder. Don't set yourself up to fail. If you do nothing else, read our post about how to not shoot yourself in the foot before you even start. It has exactly what to say to recruiters as well. All right. Thank you, guys. We hope you have a happy and healthy 2024. We hope we're right about things turning around. And if we're wrong, hey, at least we tried. All right. Thanks for watching.